Why do you wear yourself out so much trying to explain something obvious to someone who, no matter how much you insist, is never going to understand it? If you've ever walked away from an argument feeling like you'd been talking to a wall, if you've ever repeated the same point 3 different ways hoping it would finally click in the other person's mind, and that person stayed exactly the same as before you started, stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you is going to change the way you relate to almost everyone around you. For years, I also believed that if I explained things clearly enough, patiently enough, with enough examples, anyone would eventually understand what I was telling them. I thought understanding was simply a matter of communicative effort, that if it failed, the failure was mine, that I needed to find the right words, the perfect analogy, the right moment. And for a long time that generated enormous frustration in me, because no matter how hard I tried, there were people with whom there was simply no way forward. What I discovered afterward completely changed the way I understand other people, and also the way I understand myself. The first idea you need to absorb, uncomfortable as it may sound, is that a large part of the people around you aren't actually thinking. They're repeating. There's an enormous difference between reasoning something out from scratch, examining it, questioning it, testing it against other ideas, and simply inheriting a belief because someone with authority said it, because the group you belong to accepts it, or because emotionally it's more comfortable than the alternative. Most of the opinions you hear every day weren't born from a process of analysis. They were born from repetition, from belonging, from comfort. And when someone repeats instead of thinks, they aren't defending an idea, they're defending an identity. And that changes absolutely everything. Here comes something that might be even harder for you to accept. Not everyone has the same capacity to understand the same things. I'm not talking about worth as human beings, or dignity, or effort. I'm talking strictly about cognitive capacity at a given moment. You can explain something with absolute clarity, with the most flawless logic in the world, and still not manage to get the other person to understand it. And that failure isn't always yours. There's a fundamental difference between thinking, they don't want to understand me, and thinking, they can't understand what I'm trying to convey to them. The first phrase puts you in a battle of wills, as if there were a fight to win. The second phrase frees you from that battle entirely, because it stops being a matter of effort and becomes a matter of real limits, limits you're not going to be able to dissolve through sheer insistence. And I want you to notice something curious that happens constantly around us, and that's the strange relationship between how confidently someone speaks and how little they actually know about what they're talking about. The less someone knows about a topic, the more confident they tend to sound when giving their opinion on it. And the more someone genuinely knows, the more aware they become of everything they still don't know, which paradoxically generates more doubt, more nuance, more caution when speaking. This has a name in psychology, popularly known as the double incompetence effect, and it describes exactly that trap. Someone who doesn't have enough knowledge also lacks the tools to realize how much they're missing. Doubt, far from being a weakness, is actually a sign that someone is genuinely thinking, because only someone who truly examines their own ideas is capable of honestly asking themselves, what if I'm wrong? Now I want to take you one step further, because this is essential to understanding why so many arguments go nowhere. Most opinions aren't born from logic. They're born from emotion, and only afterward does logic show up to justify what the emotion had already decided beforehand. Fear comes first, anger, insecurity, pride, the need to belong to a group, and only after that comes the reasoning that tries to dress that emotion up in rational clothing. That's why it's so difficult, nearly impossible in many cases, to argue someone out of a belief using logic alone, when that belief never got there through logic in the first place. You're trying to dismantle with reasons something that was never built with reasons, and that's like trying to open a door by pushing against the side opposite its hinges. This explains why sometimes, no matter how much data, studies, or irrefutable examples you present, the other person doesn't just fail to change their mind, they cling even harder to what they already believed. There's a fairly well-studied psychological mechanism that causes exactly this. When someone feels one of their ideas is being attacked, they don't process that information as a neutral piece of data to evaluate. They process it as a threat to their own identity, and they respond exactly the way they'd respond to any other threat, by defending themselves. The stronger the attack, the stronger the resistance. You're not arguing against an idea, you're arguing against another person's psychological survival instinct, and that instinct almost always wins. So a very practical question arises, and it's probably the most important one in this entire video. If you can't change people through arguments, what's the point of constantly trying? And here I want you to internalize something that's going to save you an enormous amount of energy and emotional wear and tear going forward. Not every argument deserves your time. Before entering a debate, before trying to prove you're right, ask yourself honestly whether that particular conversation is really worth it. Because there are battles that, even if you win them on a logical level, you lose on a life level, because they leave you exhausted, irritated, with the feeling of having wasted your time arguing with someone who was never going to move an inch from their original position. Walking away from an unproductive argument isn't weakness, or cowardice, or resignation. It's a strategic decision. It's recognizing that your energy is a limited resource, and that spending it trying to convince someone who doesn't want to be convinced is, quite simply, poor management of that resource. Learning to let go of an argument before it consumes you is one of the most underrated forms of emotional maturity there is. And this connects directly to another idea I want you to burn into your mind. Don't seek validation from people who lack the ability to appreciate what you're doing. There are people who interpret depth as unnecessary complication. There are people who confuse nuance with plain confusion, as if you didn't know what you were trying to say. There are people who perceive intelligence as arrogance, and careful analysis as overthinking something that, in their view, was very simple. If you depend on the approval of those people to feel secure in your own ideas, you're going to spend your entire life feeling misunderstood. Not because your ideas are wrong, but because you're asking for evaluation from someone who lacks the tools needed to make that evaluation fairly. And I want to make this very clear. Someone incapable of understanding a given idea isn't automatically a good authority to judge it either. Now let's talk about something you may have noticed without ever putting concrete words to it. And that's what happens to our way of thinking when we're surrounded by other people, especially in large groups. Within a crowd, individual thought tends to dissolve. We start by following what everyone else does, then we simplify our own ideas so they fit better with the group. Later, we adopt simple slogans instead of elaborate arguments, and we end up reinforcing a shared identity at the cost of abandoning any uncomfortable nuance. Belonging to the group starts to matter more than discovering what's actually true. That's why, if you genuinely want to have a deep conversation with someone, it's almost always far more productive to do it with that person alone, away from the invisible pressure exerted by the collective gaze, than to attempt it in the middle of a group where any deviation from majority opinion is perceived as betrayal. There's another piece of this puzzle that's especially painful to accept, and it's that people, in general, prefer comfort over truth. Truth, many times, demands admitting mistakes, demands changing your mind, demands abandoning beliefs you'd held onto for years, and even demands reshaping your own identity, because sometimes what we believed was so intertwined with who we thought we were that letting go of it feels almost like losing a part of ourselves. Against that backdrop, a pleasant explanation, even a completely false one, can turn out to be far more psychologically appealing, because it doesn't demand that emotional cost. That's why insisting on imposing a truth on someone who, deep down, isn't willing to listen to it, almost never works. It isn't a matter of the truth not being convincing enough, it's that the person isn't ready, at that particular moment in their life, to pay the emotional price that truth demands. I want to pause for a moment on something that tends to go unnoticed: the relationship between intelligence and loneliness. The more specific your interests, your way of analyzing the world, your points of reference, your ways of reasoning, the harder it becomes to find people with whom real intellectual compatibility exists. This doesn't mean you're better or worse than anyone. It simply means the statistical probability of finding someone who thinks in a similar way decreases the more specific your own mental wiring is. And here I want to offer you a different perspective from the one you've probably heard before. A certain amount of loneliness doesn't have to be interpreted as social failure. It can simply mean you haven't yet crossed paths with the few people who truly match your way of thinking, and that, even though it's uncomfortable at times, isn't the same as doing something wrong. This leads us to another very practical idea, which is that you don't need to constantly prove what you know in every conversation you have. There's a kind of intellectual discretion that very few people practice consciously, one that consists of adjusting the depth of what you say depending on who's in front of you. With someone capable of receiving nuance, you can go as deep as you want. With someone who needs simplicity in order not to feel overwhelmed, you can simplify without that meaning you're betraying the idea. This isn't hypocrisy, and it isn't lowering yourself. It's intelligence applied strategically, instead of being used as a permanent showcase where you display everything you know, whether or not the moment calls for it. And having reached this point, I want us to bring all these pieces together into something genuinely useful, because all this information, if it stays purely theoretical, isn't worth much. When you understand that a large part of human behavior responds to emotions, to the need to protect an identity, to the pressure of authority, to the influence of the group, and to a very deep need for belonging, you stop constantly trying to change people and instead start anticipating them. You know, almost in advance, how someone is going to react to a certain type of argument, a certain type of criticism, a certain type of social pressure. And that capacity for anticipation gives you an enormous advantage, not to manipulate anyone, but simply to stop running into the same wall over and over again, expecting different results. I want to be completely honest with you about something important before we go any further. Everything we're discussing here has a solid philosophical foundation, but it shouldn't be treated as if it were an absolute, closed, scientific truth. Claiming that only a small percentage of the population truly thinks critically, or that certain people simply can't reason, are deliberately provocative statements, useful for reflection, but they shouldn't be taken as proven facts without further nuance. The ability to think critically isn't something completely fixed or completely determined from birth. It can be trained, it can be developed, even though real starting differences do exist between one person and another. So take these ideas as a useful tool for understanding general patterns, not as a definitive label to slap on every person you come across. That said, let's go back to what really matters, because the real message behind all of this is nowhere close to the superficial idea that most people are stupid. Stopping there would mean staying on the surface of something much deeper. The true lesson is this: much of our suffering appears precisely when we expect from other people something that their nature, their upbringing, their current stage in life, or their present capacity simply cannot give us. The smaller that mismatched expectation is, the smaller the frustration we feel when relating to the world will be too. This isn't about expecting less from life in general. It's about no longer demanding pears from an elm tree and starting to relate to people as they actually are, not as you wish they were. Think, for a moment, about how many pointless arguments you've had throughout your life trying to get someone to understand something they simply weren't in a position to understand at that time. Think about how much emotional energy you've spent feeling frustrated, misunderstood, even angry, because you couldn't get another person to see things exactly the way you saw them. Now imagine for a moment how much peace you could gain if you stopped treating every disagreement as a battle you have to win, and started seeing it simply as information about who's in front of you and what kind of conversation is actually possible with that particular person. Let me give you an example you'll probably recognize right away. Picture a family gathering, any dinner at all, where a touchy subject comes up. It could be politics, it could be health, it could be money. The exact topic doesn't matter. You arrive with data, with nuance, with a reasoned position you've genuinely put time into. And across from you sits someone who responds with a line they've heard repeated countless times in their circle, without ever having examined it closely. You lay out a solid argument. That person doesn't counter it with another argument. They simply repeat the same line, maybe a little louder than before. You push further, you offer another angle, another example, and the answer, in essence, comes back the same as always, now with a bit of irritation added to it. In that moment, most of us make the same mistake. We interpret that resistance as a lack of goodwill, as if the other person were being deliberately stubborn, and we double down, raise our tone, add more data, more examples, more urgency. But what's really happening, in most cases, has nothing to do with the quality of your arguments. That person isn't evaluating new information. They're protecting a position that's part of their identity, their group of belonging, years of repetition, without ever questioning it. The more pressure you apply, the more they shut down, not because your data is bad, but because the perceived threat to their worldview grows at the same rate as your insistence. Now picture the same scene, but with a different reaction from you. Instead of pushing for the 5th time, you simply observe. You acknowledge internally that this particular conversation, in this particular context, isn't going to move an inch, no matter how many arguments you bring. And you decide, completely calmly, to change the subject or simply listen without entering the fight. That isn't surrender, it's reading the terrain correctly. And the curious thing is, often that very same person you couldn't get anywhere with in a head-on argument can, weeks or months later, in a calm conversation, with no pressure involved, arrive on their own at a conclusion similar to the one you were trying to convey, simply because the change came from within, without the feeling of being forced or of losing a debate to another person. This teaches us something very valuable about time. Ideas don't always get transmitted immediately. Sometimes they're planted and germinate much later, at a moment you won't even witness. Your role isn't always to secure the visible victory at the exact moment of the conversation. Sometimes your role is simply to leave an idea planted, without needing to force its immediate growth, trusting that time, personal reflection, and that person's own experiences will do the rest of the work that no argument of yours, however good, could do in that instant. All of this also radically changes how you should measure your own social and intellectual success. Many people measure their worth by how many people they manage to convince, by how many arguments they win, by how many people end up agreeing with them. But if you accept everything we've discussed so far, that criterion stops making sense as a measure of your intelligence or your personal worth. A much healthier, much more realistic criterion is to ask yourself whether you're investing your communicative energy in the right people and the right moments, not in how many people you manage to bring around through arguments. This has a very concrete, practical consequence in how you choose your daily battles. Before responding to a provocative comment, before jumping into an argument with a stranger on social media, before trying to convince a relative at a family meal, ask yourself a simple but powerful question. If this conversation ended exactly the way it started, with no one changing their mind by even a fraction, would it still be worth it for me to take part in it? If the answer is yes, because you enjoy the exchange itself, because it helps you sharpen your own ideas, because the relationship with that person matters more than the outcome of the debate, then go ahead, take part with a clear conscience. But if the answer is no, that all you're going to be left with is exhaustion and frustration, then you already have your answer, and that answer is to walk away without needing to feel guilty about it. We used to ask ourselves why this person doesn't understand something so obvious. Now we can start asking ourselves whether that person actually has the capacity, the willingness, or the interest needed to understand it at this point in their life. We used to think we had to get someone, almost as a personal obligation, to change their mind. Now we can calmly ask ourselves whether it's really worth investing energy in trying to change it. We used to feel an urgent need for everyone to understand our way of thinking, as if it were essential to feeling valid. Now we can remind ourselves that we don't need to be understood by absolutely everyone for our ideas to keep having value. And if I had to sum up this whole reflection in a single sentence, it would be this. True intelligence doesn't consist solely of understanding more than other people. It consists of knowing when to explain in detail, when to simplify without losing the essence, when to stay silent instead of insisting, and when to simply walk away from a conversation that isn't going anywhere anymore. That capacity for discernment, far more than any accumulation of knowledge, is what really makes the difference between living exhausted, trying to convince everyone, and living at peace, relating to the right people, in the right tone, with the right expectations. If you made it this far, comment, "I'm here," and I'll personally reply to you myself. And if this resonated with you, subscribe to be part of it, and hit like if you enjoyed it.